though.
Well, yes. I mean, that's because you can read the Mishnah like we talked about last week, either on its own or more as a shorthand for some of the Talmudic points.
And not just that, you also have the Baraita and you have the Tosefta, that those were rulings that did not make it to the Mishnah that also are considered in the Talmud. So there's more.
Well, I wouldn't say they didn't make it into the Mishnah. You know, it's been a while since we've done a anatomy of the Mishnah discussion. I don't think we're going to have quite time to do that all today. So I'm just trying to sort my second monitor out here. It is being difficult. There we go. But the Mishnah and the Braitot and the Tosefta and such are not in opposition to one another. The Mishnah was simply considered to be the best version of the Torah Sheba Al Peh, the oral Torah, as recorded at the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. But the other text wasn't an opponent or a rival. It was just a different way of teaching the same thing. It's like, different lesson plans from algebra teachers. It's the same algebra, but different lesson plans were considered better or less ideal depending upon who was doing the editing of the textbook. But I don't want to get too far afield because I want to get our discussion going. If we have a little time left over, and there's a very real chance of that, then we can talk about some more of these things because I have a very strong feeling that we're going to be able to finish Mishnah Yadayim today, and that'll be the end of our next Masechet, and then we'll be on to Beitzah next week. So let's go ahead and finish up the Masechet, and then if there's time left over and additional questions about the Mishnah, we can use it then. But I definitely don't want to leave with like just one Mishnah left out of the Masechet and then have to do that next week. It's nice to be complete. Okay. So we just finished in Mishnah 4.3. And again, thank you to everybody understanding that last week we couldn't meet because of the Shiva Minyan. With talking about the territory of Ammon and Moab, just across the Jordan River. And with that in mind, we now in 4.4 are going to return to Ammon and Moab, not as territories, but as people. And as the link here from Deuteronomy 23.4 points out, the children of Ammon and Moab were not allowed to enter into the mainstream Jewish community. Conversion was not a normal process for them. Now, there's probably a couple things that are ringing bells. One, you're probably thinking, well, what about Ruth? Because Ruth was very famously from Moab, and she clearly converted as she became Boaz's wife, at the very least, if not earlier. And certainly as the great-grandmother of King David, we know that she was Jewish. The answer to that is that the prohibition on allowing the Moabites and the Ammonites to enter in the Torah is rendered in the masculine form. And the rabbis interpreted that to mean that the men of Ammon and Moab couldn't join, and the women could. But you may also be wondering, why could the Ammonites and Moabites not join? What was wrong with them? Well, yes, additionally, there were problems with our Exodus time as we went through their territory. Most of the people that we encountered on the Exodus from Egypt did not treat us very well. But there is a second reason, and that, of course, is going to be revealed in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And when we look at the heritage of Ammon and Moab, these are the children descended from Lot, that is from Abraham's nephew. And Ammon and Moab are the descendants that came from his two daughters that survived the destruction of the cities, who got their father drunk and proceeded to sleep with him. As such, their lineage is suspect, to say the least. So there is another reason why the Ammonites and Moabites were kept at arm's length from the Jewish people. I'm not going to go into the whole story. Please keep up with your parasha reading, and you will see it in all of its graphic detail. Okay, so with that as our foundation, let's get into the Mishnah. On that day, by Yom Hahu, an Ammonite convert came and stood before them in the house of study. He said to them, do I have the right to enter into the assembly? Rabban Gamliel said to him, you are forbidden. Rabbi Joshua said to him, you are permitted. Okay. So here we have an Ammonite who has become Jewish, and he wants to become mainstream. He wants to go into the normal community. And Rabban Gamliel takes the position that he is forbidden from joining the mainstream community. And Rabbi Joshua says he is permitted. Now, before we get into their positions, I just want you to recognize what is happening here. This is Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Joshua. These are the two whose fight led to the coup against Rabban Gamliel that created Bayom Hahu, on that day when Rabban Gamliel was replaced, and now the debate became more open. So Rabban Gamliel is now in a position where he cannot rely on his authority to persuade the community. Instead, he is going to have to actually persuade the community. Natan, did you have your hand up?
Yes. So if there are so many limitations and also forbidden to convert a male Ammonite to the Judaism. Okay.
Right.
So why in this situation the guy was already converted? Because if it's already converted, so it can go and enter as anyone else in the assembly. If they had some issues, not. Why did them convert him before?
So there's a couple different approaches to exactly what the status of this person was. One is to say that he had become Jewish in the same way that the Netim become Jewish, the Jebusites who had tricked Joshua. So they are officially Jewish, but they have secondary status, and they don't marry into the regular group. The same way that Mamzerim are kept at a slight distance, but are still officially Jewish, that would be his status. Another interpretation of this argument is that he hasn't actually converted, although that is the position Dr. Kolb took. But another position would be he hasn't actually converted, but he wants to convert. And he is coming as a potential ger, a potential convert at this time. And so that is another way of understanding the situation. But you're absolutely right that regardless, why did he even think to try? I mean, it's like, no, you're not allowed, because everybody knows. I mean, at this point in the time of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua, we are talking about like almost 1,000 years since the Ammonites and Moabites were prohibited in the community. So certainly this would have been a well-known issue. So why would he show up at all? Well, he showed up because he had a question. And maybe his question is getting a better reception on this day than it would have done yesterday when Rabban Gamliel was still in charge. So it's absolutely fascinating to see how this coup against Rabban Gamliel has created such an opportunity for different types of questions and different types of debate that apparently were stifled or prevented prior to that upheaval. So it definitely appears that both the Mishnah and then the Talmud in more detail approves of that upheaval. You might think that a book that was written by the rabbis for the rabbis with the idea of rabbinic authority would be hiding stories of people overthrowing rabbis. But no, it's right there front and center, and all of the information seems to be very positive, and all the commentary is very positive about the outcome from having had this upheaval. All right, so now Rabban Gamliel cannot stand on his authority. He has to actually provide his proof. Rabban Gamliel said to him, to Rabbi Yoshua, the verse says, an Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. Right? Deuteronomy, dude. It's pretty straightforward. If you're from Ammon, if you're from Moab, you can't come in. Even if you have attached yourself to Judaism for 10 generations, the 11th generation does not get to go ahead and join. Rabbi Joshua said to him, but are the Ammonites and Moabites still in their own territory? Sancheriv that's the Sennacherib, the emperor of Assyria, the king of Assyria, has long since come up and mingled all the nations. As it is said from Isaiah, in that I have removed the bounds of the people and have robbed their treasures and have brought down as one mighty the inhabitants. So Rabbi Joshua's response is, sure, an Ammonite and a Moabite can't join, but do you think the people who live in Ammon and Moab are the actual Ammonites and Moabites that were talked about in the book of Deuteronomy? Do you think this guy who happens to have a passport that says Ammon is actually an Ammonite in the biblical sense? Or do you think that when the Tanakh tells us here in the Nevi'im and Isaiah that the empires scrambled all of the nations, removed the bounds, removed their borders, that we have no way of knowing who is an Ammonite and who is a Moabite? We cannot ascertain the actual family tree lineage of these people, and we can't just rely on the zip code. We have to imagine that they have been completely commingled. Now, we know that that is exactly what Sennacherib did, because that's what happened to the 10 tribes of the north. When the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered, those 10 tribes were taken and scattered through other parts of the Assyrian Empire. So the same way that we cannot identify who they were, we cannot identify who an Ammonite and a Moabite is. And if we can't identify them, then, we cannot prohibit them, the people who happen to live in that territory, from joining now. Natan?
Sorry, Rabbi. When you say 10 tribes, I always thought about that. Well, maybe 9, because Yehuda, part of the kingdom of Yehuda, was also Benjamin. And Shimon, Reuben was absorbed by Yehuda. So there's already 3 tribes there. So also who left is only 9, not 10.
Well, and the Levites also in the south.
Yes,
So
but they were not part of the 12 tribes that received land.
right.
Because remember that the son of Joseph, they received twice.
No, I know that well. But the issue, but the issue here is the loss of the territory of the 10 tribes, the loss of their borders is what he's talking about. And those borders are now inhabited by people that are not of the 10 tribes. And that's the other side of the coin. Just as I cannot point to somebody who lives in Turkey or Kurdistan or Afghanistan, as many people have imagined, that these are the 10 tribes where they have ended up. So too, in the days of Rabbi Yoshua and the days of Rabban Gamliel, I couldn't point to someone in the Galil and say, well, if you're living in that territory, you must be Jewish. Because they knew that there were many people living there, the Samaritans most famously, but of course the Romans as well, that were clearly not actually Jewish, but had been moved in by the Assyrians and then later the Babylonians as well. So
why are they still calling the 10 tribes? Because for my mouth, there were 9 actually, not 10.
Because when the book of Kings deals with the breaking of the 10 tribes, it describes them as 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south. So it's the idiom that's used in the Tanakh. The Tanakh itself talks about the 10 in the north and the 2 in the south. But everybody knew that the tribes were not only in their territory. There were plenty of people from Menashe, Ephraim, and Zvulun and all of that lived in the south, and plenty of people from Judah that lived in the north. Not everybody was living only in their ancestral land. People mixed around and moved. But the borders, there were 10 borders in the north, and there were 2 borders in the south with Benjamin and Judah.
Benjamin and Judah, okay, in the south.
Shimon no longer had a border by the time Solomon took over.
So that's why I have the point that in the north there were actually 9, not 10 tribes. because they were 12 originally. And you have in the south Yehuda and Benjamin, and Shimon also was part of them, was absorbed by Yehuda. So you have actually 9, not 10. So that's why I cannot understand why they call them 10.
You know, I'd have to go back and double check the original citation in Malachim Aleph, but that is the idiom that gets used. But you make a very good point that were there actually 10 bordered tribes? Now, even more, just to stretch the idiom further, there weren't bordered tribes anywhere prior to the Civil War, meaning that the kingdom had become all one kingdom. That you didn't hear, after David took over, you didn't hear about Issachar, you didn't hear about Gad and Asher. Occasionally, you might get a reference to someone as being part of a tribe, but all of the tribes were now part of the Davidic line and then the Solomon kingdom. And we didn't hear about their borders anyway. So it seems to be an idiom that may not be based in reality, that may be based more in just the legacy of the territories, even though by the time it was being taken from Solomon's son, nobody was counting tribes anyway.
North, if I remember correctly, when they were all the different putsch from the different generals, they name, this guy was from the tribe of. So in the North, I think that they conserve more the tribe identity, at least from the family one, from where they came.
Yeah, as a family, it definitely seems to come up, but it doesn't seem to be borders. And that's the point of this particular argument by Rabbi Yoshua, is that the borders don't matter anymore, that everybody has been mixed up. And note that is also a very important issue when it comes to Jewish people, like mainstream Jewish people, that even today, or maybe even especially today in the modern world, there are many people who argue that because the Jews aren't from the borders of Israel recently, that we don't count as real Jews, and that we're the wrong genetics, and that we are from Asia, and the Khazars and all of that other nonsense. And there are many people who use that as an anti-Semitic line, that the people, us, who call themselves Jewish, don't deserve to be called Jewish, and get attacked. I may be dating this video for those who watch later, but there was recently an argument with Kanye West about who are the real Jews, and that whole argument is based upon that mistaken understanding that the real Jews are somehow different than the people who actually go around calling themselves Jews nowadays. But that's a whole nother argument. But
you still have the Kohanim and Leviim, they are original and true Jews.
Be very careful. I'm guessing that you are referring to the genetics, but does that mean that you would say that everybody who wants to be a Kohen has to take a genetic test? And if they don't have it, we would forbid them?
And the Leviim, they came from the ancestors, from the original ones, Kohanim and Leviim, because they couldn't convert. They were original ones, so they passed from generation to generation. So at least for the males, they are connected to the original ones.
Well, yes and no. I mean, do you know that everybody who says they are a Levi or a Kohen is actually a Levi or a Kohen? How do you know in 1200 some guy named Mayor didn't go to a new town and say, you know what, I'm a Kohen in this new town? We don't know. And in fact, the Mishnah talks about that there are people who are Kohen that aren't really Kohen, and people that are not Kohen that really should be considered Kohen. And that's something that Mashiach will have to straighten out.
Where? In which Masechet?
I'm trying to remember. I can't remember off the top of my head.
That was the last one of Ediot, right?
Was it Ediot? It may have very well been Ediot. That sounds about right.
Elijah comes and separates all the Jews?
Yeah, exactly. So if that's Ediot, then thank you very much, Aaron. But that whole idea of who counts as being really from and really not from, that is a question that, generally speaking, we've said we'll wait for Mashiach to sort out. And they lean on the side of inclusion, not exclusion, very important from that Mishnah. But here, Rabbi Joshua is basically flipping that around and saying, well, if that works for Jewish people, then that's also going to have to work for how we deal with the non-Jewish people from Ammon and Moab. Now, Rabban Gamliel is going to respond. Rabban Gamliel said to him, the verse says, now in Jeremiah, but afterward I will bring back the captivity of the children of Ammon. They have already returned, right? Okay, fine, maybe they got mixed up, but eventually Ammon will be back in Ammon, and thus, if they are back, then they are back. So that means now they count as being from that territory. But Rabbi Joshua points out, Rabbi Joshua said to him, another verse now from Amos, I will return the captivity of my people, Israel and Judah. Same style of phrase, yet they have not returned. So what we have here is this argument over what's called Gezerah Shava. If you have a similar term in two places, can you learn from that one place something about the other place? Now, what happened was Rabban Gamliel was saying, it says that eventually the children of Ammon and also in Jeremiah, the children of Moab will be returned. And so he is arguing, look, Sennacherib is gone. Even the Babylonians are gone. Could you imagine that the Ammonites are back in their land, right? Why not? But Rabbi Yoshua says, but look, in Amos, when we're talking about returning people to their land, we talk about Israel and Judah. And when we talk about returning Israel and Judah to their land, we don't just mean an end to the Babylonian captivity. We mean Mashiach. We mean the end of days. And has that happened? Has the ingathering of the exile taken place? Because if it hasn't, then why would you assume the ingathering of the Ammonites and Moabites has taken place? But just because there are people living there doesn't mean it's happening. Just because there are people living in Judea doesn't mean that it is also the days of Mashiach right now, Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua. And the answer, of course, is, so they permitted him to enter the assembly. That Rabbi Yoshua wins. Rabbi Yoshua wins. That he is indeed allowed to be considered a full Jew because he's not considered an Ammonite. It doesn't matter what his zip code is, what his passport said, what territory he lived in. Everyone's been mixed, and thus everybody is no longer bound by the Ammonite, Moabite rules or things like that. Now, if you are getting ready to say, but wait a minute, there's another solution. We are prohibited from accepting Moabites and Ammonites. Well, if we're prohibited from accepting Moabites and Ammonites, then if we don't know who is a Moabite and an Ammonite, then I guess we should just accept no converts at all until we can figure it out. Right? If I tell you that there are 1,000 people who want to become Jewish, and some of them, a small number, might be Ammonite or Moabite, and we're not allowed to convert Ammonite and Moabites, what would your response be? Don't convert any of the 1,000, because we might accidentally be letting an Ammonite and Moabite in. But that is not the conclusion that the Mishnah and the Talmudic discussion reach. Instead, we follow the majority. If the majority of the people in Moab today are not actual Moabites, if the majority of the people in Ammon are not actual Ammonites, then we don't check each one, we just accept them, because the people from that territory are now so blurred that we have no way to establish, and we're not going to establish their lineage. They are all permitted at this point. I know, the Mishnah and Talmud are just so liberal. Whoever knew that saying yes was actually a very important Jewish answer. All right, back to our hands. Remember, that's the topic of the Masechet, not actual, conversion or Ammonites, or even the Biyom Hahu, the things that were decided on that day. We are back to our topic. And remember that we began this whole topic of on that day by talking about Kohelet and Shir HaShirim, the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Song of Songs, about whether or not they also defiled the hands. Remember, defiling the hands is the benchmark way of saying this counts as a holy book. This counts as part of the canon. Excuse me. Well, here in 4.5, we are resuming that discussion about other texts that are iffy, that are on the border. The Aramaic sections in Ezra and Daniel defile the hands. Okay, wait a minute. There's Aramaic in the book of Ezra and the book of Daniel? Yes, there is. In the book of Ezra and Daniel, certain passages, much more in Daniel than Ezra, are written in Aramaic because they are written from a time period when Aramaic was becoming the common language of not just the Jewish people, but of the regional area. Much like English now has spread across the globe as a second language for so many people, so too Aramaic was a second language or even a first language for many people. And during this time period, you ended up with more and more people knowing Aramaic better than they knew Hebrew. But that aside, in both the book of Ezra and the book of Daniel, there are sections that are written in Aramaic. Does that count as part of the Sifrei Kodesh, as the holy books? Or since it was written in Aramaic, is it not really holy? And the answer is, it is holy. That even though it is written in Aramaic and not Hebrew, it is considered to be a holy part of the book. In fact, if an Aramaic section was written in Hebrew, or a Hebrew section was written in Aramaic, or the Hebrew which was written with Hebrew script, it does not defile the hands. So, in fact, the Aramaic is so intrinsic that if you took the Aramaic and wrote it into Hebrew instead, like a translation of parts of Daniel, and then put that would be considered a translation, and it would not defile the hands, which, by the way, is why we know that if you are reading an all-English translation of the Tanakh, that it is not considered a true holy book in the sense of defiling the hands. We still treat it with respect. We still, treat it with the utmost dignity, but it is one step below a book that has the Hebrew for Tanakh in it. And I'm sorry for all of my English lovers out there.
So books that Tanakh that is translated, you can read out like any other book.
If it is 100% in not Hebrew or Aramaic, yes. If it is just like the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society classic translation that you can still buy, where it's 100% English all the way through, technically that is of a lower level than a copy that has Hebrew and English on the pages. And yes, you can technically treat it like another book, but you still should have kavod. You should have more respect for it. Don't treat it like a Harry Potter novel. Okay, but it's the second half of this verse that I find a lot of people get surprised by. That if the Hebrew section was written in Hebrew, that it doesn't defile the hands. Like, well, why would it not? I mean, Hebrew should be written in Hebrew, right? But which Hebrew do you mean? We are not talking about the Hebrew that you all know and love. We are talking here about biblical Hebrew, which is an entirely different alphabet. It's still Aleph, Bet, Gimel, but the form of the letters is entirely different. And that's the alphabet that they are discussing here. That if you were to write a Tanakh in the ancient Hebrew version, that Tanakh would not be considered a holy book. Now, where might we find exactly such a book written exactly as a Torah written in the ancient script? Among the Samaritans. To this day, the Samaritans still use the older Hebrew script rather than the new Hebrew script, which is what's called the Assyrian script. And that is a distinction between us and the Samaritans. Now, there's a lot of argument about the change of font, changing over the font, of going from the archaeological script, which you can still find in archaeological discoveries. Even some of the Dead Sea Scrolls have some of it written in that script. But then you also have the Assyrian script, which is what we are all familiar and use. Now, there are a lot of questions and topics about this particular history. I'm not going to go through all of it. But I do want to give both the traditional explanation as well as the historical explanation. because I'm a conservative rabbi. I like to do both. So
you think, Rabbi, that the rabbis added this part in order to put the Samaritans on outside? Be sure that also there's another fence to divide both communities?
certainly the rabbis looked for every opportunity to make sure that the Samaritans were outside of the Jewish community, because they are a different religion and a different culture. And I think this was partly here because it is talking about the defilement of the hands, but I think it is also here after the discussion of allowing the Ammonite and the Moabite in, to explain that we're not throwing the door open for everything. That if someone shows up with a Samaritan Bible, that doesn't mean that we accept that as being kosher. So I think there is a careful editing going on here. So let me just finish off this Mishnah, and then we'll go back and do the history here. It never defiles the hands, meaning any of the books of the Torah, until it is written in the Assyrian script on parchment and in ink. That is exactly the way you need to write if you want to write a Torah or Tanakh. And indeed, that means also our printed Humashim do not defile the hands. Only the actual klaf, the actual text of the Torah, defiles the hands. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put Dr. Kolp's explanation up here at the bottom, just to go along with my own verbal explanation. So the ancient Hebrew script, as he points out, often called the Phoenician script, is a much older, very angular looking script. It doesn't even look like modern Hebrew at all. The letters are the same in the sense that there is an aleph in both, there is a bet in both, there is a gimel in both. Think of it like trying to read a block letter in that old Gothic writing versus a cursive letter in the modern writing. They look very, very different. And just because you can read modern cursive doesn't mean you can read ancient block letters from the 1300s in English. So too, the languages, they look very, very different. Now, historically, it seems that there was a transition period around the Babylonian exile where the Jewish people began to adopt the Assyrian script, which was brought back from the exile, from the Iraqi area, the Babylonian area, because, no offense, it's better. It's just a much, much easier writing system. It is much more fluid with a pen and ink. The other worked fine for scratching inscriptions or carving, but really the Assyrian script is much better if you move into a parchment, paper-based, ink-based kind of writing system. The same way that in English we have, or in Hebrew, modern Hebrew, the cursive script is so much easier to use if you actually have a pen or pencil in your hand compared to the block script. That too, the Assyrian script completely took over because it was just much easier to use. Now, traditionally, that's not the explanation. Traditionally, the explanation is that the Torah was given in the Assyrian script, but because of our transgressions, we were forbidden from using it, and we were forced to use the ancient Hebrew script, or as Joseph points out in the comments, what's often called the Paleo-Hebraic script. And that way, we actually have this time period where we were forced to use the bad writing, and then we eventually were able to return to the Assyrian script, which was the good writing. Now, that argument doesn't hold a lot of water historically in terms of both the archaeology as well as the transition period, where we see the Assyrian script replacing the earlier Hebrew script. We can find from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other inscriptions of those time periods that there was a transition period where people would use both depending upon what they were writing. In particular, we find that some people were very reluctant to write God's name, the Yud He Vav He, in the modern, for them, Assyrian script. And you'll find some passages written entirely in the Assyrian script with the Paleo-Hebrew just wherever God's name occurs. So historically, it doesn't look like we started with Assyrian and returned to Assyrian and had the Paleo in the middle. Historically, it looks like we started with Paleo, and then we ended up with a better version. And we didn't change the words, we didn't change the meaning. We simply swapped this way of writing an Aleph for this way of writing an Aleph, because it made sense. It made it easier to write and share books. Questions or comments? Okay, that's the short version. Please, feel free to look it up. It's a very interesting topic, and you look up actual examples, they're good, but we don't have time to go through. All right, now, our last, I started late, but I'm gonna push. Our last few Mishnayot are dealing with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, this is a popular topic in many different communities. It's one that I've been asked about a lot, but as Dr. Kolp is pointing out, although the rabbis shared many of the same values as the Pharisees, they were not identical one for one with the Pharisees. That is to say, there was a period where you had Sadducees, Pharisees, and more broadly put, rabbinic Jews who believed in the oral tradition, with some of them being Pharisaic in their attitude, outlook, or teachings, and some of them not being Pharisaic and being more in line with what we would recognize as being rabbinic Judaism. And in these last few Mishnayot, we're going to look at arguments between the Sadducees and Pharisees, with the rabbis kind of weighing in and kind of participating almost as a Pharisee, but not exactly. So that's where we are going in the next one. I'm just getting a slow walk through Dr. Kolp's introduction for more information for those who want to pause on YouTube. And let's get down to the topics. The Sadducees say, "We complain against you Pharisees because you say the Holy Scriptures defile the hands, but the books of Homer do not defile the hands." All right. So the Pharisees clearly are in the same camp as the rabbis, with the idea that Sifrei Kodesh caused that defilement of the hands. And that means, of course, that non-holy books do not. And the Sadducees are basically saying, that's stupid. How can you say that the books that are holy defile the hands, but the books from the Greeks, the works of Homer, don't? I mean, surely the books of Homer are worse than the books of Torah. Therefore, if defilement is happening, it should be the bad books that defile more than the good books. Typical Sadduceic opinion, trying to gotcha because the logic of the teaching doesn't make sense. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, have we nothing against the Pharisees but this? Right? So Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is basically trying to say, is that really the best argument you can come up with? But what he's actually doing is making fun of the opinion of the Sadducees. Behold, they, meaning the Pharisees, but also in this particular case, the rabbinic community, say that the bones of a donkey are clean, yet the bones of a high priest are unclean. Now, what is going on here? He's saying we don't always render things as being pure or impure based upon how desirable they are or how special they are. That is, you're getting it wrong, because, everybody agrees, because of what we actually know from Torah, that the priests, the bones of a person definitely will cause someone to be unclean. As Dr. Kolp points out, the word donkey, of course, which is hamor, is probably a pun on the name Homer as well in this little back and forth. They said to him, meaning, so what is the actual explanation the Sadducees would explain for the illogic that they see about the bones? according to the affection for them, so is there a purity, so that nobody should make spoons out of the bones of his father or mother. That we need to make sure that people treat the bones of people better than they treat the bones of donkeys, because people are attached to their loved ones. And because of that attachment, they might come to do something stupid, like carve a bone out of the body piece of a loved one. And indeed, other cultures did that sort of thing. They would keep relics of their loved ones. And to make sure we didn't, we put that in place. Now, the Sadducees, of course, are explaining about bones, but the argument works just as well when explaining about the books. He said to him, so also are the Holy Scriptures according to the affection for them. So is their uncleanness. The books of Homer, which are not precious, do not defile the hands. So yes, that same logic explains why we treat the holy books different than we treat other books. It's not because the holy books are worse and thus defile, but it is precisely to prevent their misuse that we put them on this pedestal of purity, which causes defilement, to prevent us from interacting with them inappropriately, as we talked about in an earlier class. Yes, Aaron, thank you for waiting.
Yes. So with Rabban Zakkai, when he's arguing with, not Rabban, Johann Zakkai, when he's arguing with the Pharisees, he's actually the first person to carry the title rabbi that we know about, right?
Correct. And he's not arguing with the Pharisees. He's actually arguing with the Sadducees, but pretending like he is arguing against the Pharisees to show that the Pharisees teach something else that even the Sadducees would agree with. And if you follow the logic around bones, then you'll understand the logic around the hands. But he is seeing himself as being not a Pharisee, but clearly he is agreeing with this particular Pharisaic position.
Do we know what group of people he came from as being the first rabbi?
No, we don't have any attribution of him as being Pharisaic or Sadduceic. Sadduceic? I guess that's the right word. All right, 4:7, must press on. The Sadducees say, we complain against you Pharisees that you declare an uninterrupted flow of a liquid to be clean. So if there is a pouring from a vessel and the liquid flows down from the vessel onto something which is impure, the Pharisees say that nonetheless, that the flow is still ritually clean. And in fact, the vessel is also ritually clean. Whereas the Sadducees seem to think that if it's an uninterrupted, I mean continuing stream, then how can you claim it to be not touching? The stream is touching. The Pharisees say, we complain against you, Sadducees, that you declare a stream of water which flows from a burial ground to be clean. All right, so the rebuttal is that the Pharisees are trying to say is that, but you could be, how could you, if there is a river that is receiving runoff from the groundwater by a cemetery, the river is clean. So if the river that comes from a cemetery is clean, why would a pouring from a bottle also not be clean? So that's their counter argument. The Sadducees complain, we complain against you Pharisees that you say my ox or donkey which has done injury is liable, yet my male or female slave who has done injury is not liable. Now, if in the case of my ox or my donkey, for which I am not responsible if they do not fulfill religious duties, yet I am responsible for their damages in the case of my male or female slaves, for whom I am responsible to see that they fulfill mitzvot, how much more so should I be responsible for their damages? So they're arguing that the idea that a master would not be responsible for the damages done by his slaves makes no sense, because if he's responsible for the animals, then he should also be responsible for his slaves. This is what's known as a kal v'chomer argument, that if he is responsible for an animal for whom he has no duty with regards to the mitzvot, then surely he should also be responsible for a slave for whom he does have a duty for mitzvot. Obviously, the rabbinic and Pharisaic position was not correct. Did not view that as being correct. Response, they said to him, no, if you argue about my ox or my donkey, which have no understanding, you can deduce from there anything concerning a female or male slave who do have understanding, right? Can you really make this as a comparison? I know you want to make a kal v'chomer and all the more so argument, but it has to be apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And there's a big difference between the mental capacity of a slave and the mental capacity of a donkey. And a donkey does not have its own mental capacity and thus relies upon the mental capacity of the owner, not to a slave. So that if I were to anger either of them and they would go and burn another person's stack, should I be liable to make restitution? Right? That clearly, clearly, that doesn't make sense, right? Just put it into this position. If I were to go over and talk to just Bob on the street, and I make Bob angry, and Bob goes off and lights somebody's house on fire, am I responsible for Bob lighting someone else's house on fire? No, because Bob chose to do that, right? I didn't force him to. Bob chose to do that. On the other hand, if I were to make a donkey angry and it runs off and burns something on fire, would I be responsible for that? Well, perhaps, because if I tied a torch to the back of a mule and I sent it running through the field, the donkey wasn't making a decision for what it was doing. I was. I am the last cognizant creature involved in the action. Thus, I would be responsible. So this idea of legal awareness, as Dr. Culp puts it, is very important. And as he also points out, probably something that was not universal in the ancient world, where slaves were treated more like animals rather than humans who were temporarily subject to the orders of a different person. All right, and our final Mishnah, and we are talking here about the word mean. This is the Hebrew word mean, not the English word mean. And mean is a heretic. It's somebody that is opposed to Judaism, but from inside the Jewish group. A mean is not an outside threat, it is an internal threat. As Dr. Cole points out, in some editions, it is worded with the word Sadducee, but that is because the word mean often refers to Christians in many of the early rabbinic writings, because the early Christians were a subgroup of Jews who changed and overturned much of Judaism in their way, eventually becoming a separate religion entirely. As such, they often get referred to as mean in the early days. Now, this particular text is clearly not talking about Christians. That seems to be the case. Nevertheless, as Dr. Culp points out, during the Middle Ages, many printings of the Mishnah were forced to edit to match the censorship of the Christian church. As such, the word mean was changed to Sadducee so that it would not be thought that this might be referring to Christians. And we can have a class some other day if you want about the different censorship of the Christian church on Jewish texts. All right. A Galilean mean said, I complain against you Pharisees that you write the name of the ruler and the name of Moses together on a divorce document.
Sorry, Rabbi, I missed the last part of what you say, that the church make that they will match the mean with the Christianity or not?
The church thought that every place we say mean, that it is a secret attack against Christians.
Okay.
And so they forced us to take the word mean out of as many places as they could. But in this particular case, it doesn't sound like a Christian argument. So it's, they just didn't read it or they would have understood. But, in the name of censorship, who bothers to read? So here the question is, if you are writing a get, if you are writing a legal document, you have to name not only Moses, because it's going according to Jewish law, but you also have to name the current ruler, because you had to have the right year that was reckoned according to the reign of whoever was currently emperor. And that meant that, yes, you would have the name of Moses and the name of the Roman emperor together on the same page. And apparently for this sectarian, this group, how dare you write Moses and the name of Tiberius on the same piece of paper, right? That was what this particular heretic was upset about. So just a reminder, heretics weren't always people who were saying Judaism should be weaker or more lenient or go away and allow more. Some heretics were people that were trying to argue against rabbinic law, that it should be stricter and more demanding and allow less. We see much more of that later on in Jewish history when we get to the Karaite group that in many ways tried to create a much stricter version of Judaism by rejecting rabbinic teachings. The Pharisees said, and we complain against you, Galilean mean, not really, but this is poking fun at them, that you write the name of the ruler together with the divine name on a single page, meaning of the Torah. And furthermore, that you write the name of the ruler above and the divine name below, mean higher you write the name of a pagan ruler and below you write God's name, as it is said. And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should hearken to his voice to let Israel go? But when he was smitten, what did he say? The Lord is righteous, right? So Pharaoh said, who is the Lord? Pharaoh's name comes first and Adonai comes later. So clearly you are being terrible for writing the name Pharaoh above the name God on the same piece of paper. Now, what the rabbis are saying on behalf of a Pharisaic position that they happen to agree with is, don't be stupid. It doesn't matter if Moses and Tiberius are on the same page any more than if Pharaoh and Adonai are on the same page. That doesn't give any extra status to either Pharaoh or Tiberius. It's just the page. It's just what you're supposed to write. And if you're going to be so supercilious about we can't write Moses's name on the same page as the name of a non-Jewish ruler, then you're going nuts. And likewise, then what are you going to make of the Torah or the rest of Tanakh, where all of these names become mixed on different pages as the story requires? So that it finishes off, I think rather interestingly, with a way of mocking those who become too strict, of those who go off the deep end of making too many requirements. So we have really seen a full range throughout this entire Masechet of, in first place, inventing an entirely new requirement of washing the hands before eating, and then requiring very little to fulfill that with the minimum amount of water needed in multiple situations, but then increasing the strictness with regards to how we treat holy books by treating them as though they would, what's the English word? Mitameh, defile, render impure the hands. And then we walk back the whole discussion of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua and fighting back against rabbinic authority. And then we finish off by defending rabbinic authority against people who want too little and too much of it. And it's just, I mean, that's why I love Yadayim. It's got everything in it to tell us that there is a balance. It is not about always being strict or always being lenient or always, making things no, or yes, that it is about finding the right balance. And that comes from debate, discussion, and not just authority, as Rabban Gamliel found out. And instead is this whole integrated Jewish process that's been going on now for more than 2,000 plus years. And
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, it's just it's why I really I appreciate so much the artistry of this Masechet.
But in the last page, they didn't answer the argument about the calendar.
What do you mean? Mean about having the name of the Roman guy?
The ruler at the same time with the Jewish calendar?
They said it's fine.
An answer.
No, it's normal. I mean, like we learned in Gittin, you have to have the calendar date, and you have to say that it's, of course, being done Kedat Moshe in the laws of Moses. So of course you write them both on the same page. Big deal, right? I mean, if I'm in religious school and I'm writing up the history of the Roman emperors, and I'm saying that from Moses to Tiberius or from Moses to Vespasian or something, am I not allowed to write their names on the board? I mean, of course I am. And am I not allowed to write them on the get? Of course I am. It's the way they answered was so sarcastic that that was the answer of, if you're going to worry about who shares the page with whom, then you're not even going to be allowed to write a Torah, because that's just a crazy position. So they're not answering it directly. They're answering it with mocking humor, with sarcasm, which again, I thank you for letting me point that out. I love the fact that the rabbis can joke at somebody that's being too much, that's being too extreme. All right, I know we've gone over a little bit because we began a little late, but we have finished Masechet Yadayim. We will begin Masechet Beitzah next week. Yes.
It's very interesting that we finish with that comment, Rabbi, one day after the elections in Israel.
No comment on the elections in Israel. It's going to take a while to see what the coalition brings and the direction that it heads. But who knows? We may have another election in 6 months. Who knows?
Strong coalition.
It's a strong coalition as long as it wants to remain a strong coalition. But a strong coalition means that all the members of the coalition can twist an elbow here or there.
They're fairly united, unlike the last coalition.
We're going to find out. We're going to find out. Everybody's united until it comes time to divide the pie and make policy. And then everybody has their own positions. But that's a whole nother conversation, because a lot of it comes down to the way Israel's electoral system works with the threshold system and all of that. But that's a whole nother conversation. But for tonight, thank you all for studying. Continue your hard work, and I will see you next week for Beitzah. A reminder to those checking in that I'm also starting my Torah trope class tomorrow night. I'll be sending out a reminder about that, as well as there'll be links in my YouTube for getting access to the recordings and documents. Take care, everyone.
Everyone, and Mazal Tov, Rabbi, for finish another Masechet.
Another notch on the belt.
How many more do we have?
Oh, there are plenty. We're not going to run out, but we're going to get into Kiddushim and Torot and Zeraim, and then we're going to have to probably decide if we want to loop back or change our studies, because many of those topics are so esoteric or non-applicable that it might be hard for people to enjoy them.
Rabbi, can we do some of the midrash like you were talking about, doing the exegesis and stuff?
We're going to have to talk to everyone. Once we finish all of the Masechtot we want to do, then we'll talk about whether we want to go back and do like midrash halacha or